Hello, Yes Prep. This is Ms. Garcia, the Director of Student Support from Braes Oaks. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is the next lesson, next advisory lesson during Latinx Heritage Month. I, along with Ms. Macias, get the honor of leading the Latinx Summit for the district every year, and so we're so excited to be able to educate you guys on different components of the Latinx community while celebrating our culture at the same time. The due first question is right there for this session. If you have not already grabbed something to write with and a writing utensil, go ahead and do that. The due first question reads, you may have noticed before on paperwork for school or the US Census, for example, that Latino and Latinx or Hispanic is not listed as a race. Why do you think that is? So on the left, you could see a picture of the US Census. The first question reads, is this person of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? And then it gives you options. And then the next question is, what is this person's race? Why are those two different questions on the same form? As a reminder for this session, you're going to need a writing tool to capture notes and somewhere to capture those notes. And so if you have not already gotten paper and a pencil or something else to write with, please go ahead and do that right now. We have two main objectives for today's lesson. The first objective reads, students will be able to understand why Latinx is considered an ethnicity and not a race. And the next objective is students will be able to understand why Latinx individuals can be of different races, but still be categorized as Latinx individuals. And so we are going to start today's session, but keep those two objectives in mind as we go through today's session. Before we start talking about race, ethnicity, and other terms, I wanted to make sure I took the time to define them as we'll be using them in this session. Of course, these words have different definitions, and you'll notice that they are a little basic definitions, but I wanted people to understand the main points of these definitions and how they're used in our session. So race is the idea that the human species is divided into distinct groups on the basis of inherited physical and behavioral differences. These distinct groups are created by society and not biology. And so what that means is we as a society, as people, created the notion of race. Our bodies are very, very similar. And so scientifically, these groups that we put ourselves in or other people have put us in are not based on science or biology, but rather society and the rules we created in society. The second definition you'll see is ethnicity. So an ethnic group is a group of people who are considered to be the same in some or multiple ways. They may all have the same ancestors, speak the same language, or have the same religion. They often live in the same or surrounding area. So a big ethnic group we are talking about is Latinx. Latinx is an ethnic group of people that have very similar characteristics, no matter where, even if they're not necessarily from the same country. So there are many ethnic groups all over the world. Even within the Latinx ethnic groups, there are ethnic groups within that group as well. And last but not least, I wanted to define nationality as the fact or state of belonging to a particular country. I think sometimes in the Latinx community, outside communities mix up those terms. So for example, when a Salvadorian student or a Guatemalan student is called Mexican, people I think are generally referring to the ethnicity of Latinx or Hispanic, but they are using a nationality term. And so I wanted to clarify those terms before we start in the session to understand what race and ethnicity and what the difference is there and how nationality does play a factor into it, but it is completely different. I wanted to start the session by giving you guys a historical context of race in Latin America. This is going to be an incredibly brief historical context and of course missing many movements, but the idea of race in Latin America really started to be defined by the Spanish that colonized Latin America. So when the Spanish colonized Latin America, they established a social hierarchy based on race called the casta system. very similar to the caste system used in India. The casta system labeled people according to race. Certain racial groups had access to opportunities and resources and rights over other groups. So the Spanish come in and establish a system based on how purely Spanish they are or they are not. And so they establish a system. You'll see the picture on the left that's kind of like a pyramid shaped. The top of that pyramid are Spanish people born in Spain. And so they were the top of their system. The second row you'll see is the term for Spaniards who were born in the Americas. So Spanish people who came over and they had children here in the Americas, their kids were considered lower than they were because they were not from Spain. The next level are two different words there. The word mestizo means a mixture of Native American and Spanish blood, and mulattos, which means a mixture of Spanish blood and African American blood, or African blood at the time. And so those were the next level, and below those, what you see are the African slaves that were brought over to Latin America and the Native Americans that were already here when the Spanish came. And so they created a system that was based in race, and that race would give you access to resources. Now, this is a very simplified version of the system they created. The image on right next to it where you see the different pictures was just a categorize of how they would categorize people who were part this and part that. And so because there were many groups involved, there were many types of mixes happening with people, and they categorized each one and made it fit into their hierarchy. This system would create a lot of inequity in Latin America and would continue to affect the politics, the resources, the economies, and the stabilities of the countries of Latin America to this day. We started with the casta system in the previous slide to understand that there are many reasons why Latin America and race is actually a very complicated topic to talk about. So because of the effects of the casta system, the ways of immigration, and the modernization of the world, that has made Latin America one of the most racially diverse regions in the world. And so there is no one race inside of Latin America. There is a multitude of races and mixes of those races that now comprise Latin America. Even saying that, there is no single racial group that makes up more than 40% of the population. And so as you can see on the right, there are so many groups, and obviously those are not all the groups, but they are groups that categorize those people, and most of the countries within Latin America do not have a single group. And so if you see that blue color, that is to distinguish the mestizo race, which is the mix of Native American and Spanish blood. Through Mexico, you can see parts of Argentina, Chile, and throughout Central America. The yellow part is predominantly Native American, and so many countries still have a predominantly Native American population. Peru, Bolivia, Central America, you see, has a lot. Southern Mexico has a lot. The red represents a triracial, and so you could think of the mixture of three different races, most commonly Native American, Spaniard, and Black. But there are all kinds of other races that could be involved in those triracial groups there. The bright green you'll see is predominantly European. And so when immigration came over, you have a lot of predominantly European, so Spaniard and other waves of Europeans who came over. So you'll see southern Argentina, the south of Brazil, and the Caribbean have some of that. The brownish color is a mulatto, which we talked about was a mixture of Spanish blood and Black from Africa. And so that mixture of that is throughout Latin America, as you can see. And then the pink color is Black African. And so that also you can see is throughout Central America, the Caribbean, Brazil, and parts of South America. So like I said before, there's a lot of examples of different races inside of Latin America. And so those individuals are still considered Latinx or Hispanic individuals because of their culture and where they're from and the language they speak, but they fit into different racial categories. So for example, a white Latinx individual, an example of that in South America, usually in Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, saw massive immigration waves from Europe during different points in history. So those people can still be considered white and Latinx at the same time. Afro-Latino individuals have a strong presence in Latin America, and they are both Black and Latinx individuals. So Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, Venezuela, República Dominicana, and Ecuador all have over 1 million Afro-Latinos in their population. And so they make up a significant number of the population in those countries and other countries as well. And then there are Asian Latinos. I don't think a lot of people think through what that means, but there are a lot of Asian immigrants, both from East Asia and Southeast Asia in Latin America today. So Latin America has the largest group of people from the Middle Eastern descent outside of the Middle East itself. And so we have a lot of Middle Eastern influence in South America particularly, and then just up to 15% of Peru's population has at least some Chinese ancestry. So there is also Chinese and Japanese influence in South America, particularly in Peru and Brazil as well. As we can tell from the previous slides, race in Latin America is a very complicated issue that has many people involved, historical context involved, and immigration involved. And so one additional layer we add once we get into the US is the immigration of Latin Americans to the United States and how we're categorized racially here in the United States. And so while the categorizations of Hispanic and Latinx people has affected many areas in the US and for Latinx people, we're going to narrow it down and talk about the census. The reason we're talking about the census is because the census is the official way in which the government counts as people. And so the way we are categorized as a people really comes down to what the census says and how we're categorized on that official document. And so I'm going to take a step back really quick. The census is like I said, the process by which a government counts as people. For the United States, that happens every 10 years, and there is a census this year. Hopefully earlier your parents filled out the census online or by paper, and you guys kind of got to see that process. If you didn't, the census asks a series of questions to find out who is living where and what kind of people are where in the country. And so if you remember from the first slide, it asks specific questions around race and ethnicity. And so how the US writes the census really is important to how people are counted. And so when we talk about racial categories in the US, that's why I want to reference and root it in the census language. And so since the year 1980, the Census Bureau has asked everyone in the US about their Hispanic origin separately from their race. And since 2000, it has allowed people to select more than one race in addition to their Hispanic background. And so again, if you'll recall the census questions from the first slide, it asked first, are you of Hispanic, Latinx, or Spanish origin? And then it gave you options, no, and then yes, Mexican origin, Cuban origin, Puerto Rican origin. And so it gave options, and then it asked what the race of the individual is. And so if you think back, most Latinx individuals are a combination of multiple races. And so it wasn't until the year 2000 in which Latinx individuals were able to select more than one race. And so Latinx individuals in the US, as they're filling out their census, have to make a decision of how they racially categorize themselves outside of their Hispanic or Latino identity. However, a new survey of multiracial Americans finds that for 2/3 of Hispanics, their Hispanic background is part of their racial background and not something separate. And so saying is over half of Latinos, Hispanic, consider their background, their Hispanic or Latino background as their race, not necessarily something separate like the US Census counts it. So this suggests that Hispanics have a unique view on race that doesn't necessarily fit within the US definition of how race is categorized on this very important document. And so I want to thank you guys for paying attention and thinking through some of the concepts shared with you in this session. You guys are about to jump into a discussion with your advisory. And so definitely Would love to hear your thoughts on the following questions. And I hope that you learned something today about how Latinx individuals or Hispanic individuals view and are categorized in a racial context. So you can share by answering any of the following questions on your own experience. What is something new that you learned? What is something you already were aware of? How does this apply to you or someone that you know? And then the final question, and I hope you guys engage in a really good discussion about it, is do you think the US should add Hispanic or Latinx as an option under the race category in the census and in other paperwork? It has been an absolute pleasure to be with you guys today. Hopefully you guys engaged in really purposeful discussion and got to hear some really great opinions. This is going to be my reminder and my plug to complete your exit ticket so that your campus can hear your thoughts on today's session. Also, you guys can see an additional resource. There is a really great YouTube video. It's called If Mexicans Isn't a Race, Then What Race Are They? The Race of Hispanics and Latinos. That does a great job of going over a lot of the things that we talked about today a little bit more in depth. And then there is a great article that says on the census who checks Hispanic and who checks white and why. That explains a little bit more about the census and what we talked about with that today. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys during the next advisory session.